That's impossible. Marin.
I didn't know this was your event.
Why did you disappear? Why didn't you tell me?
I waited for you. I wrote to you twice.
You wrote to me.
I wrote twice. I waited for an answer.
Who kept these from me?
I should have fought for you.
Some things can't be undone.
Then give me one chance, just one.
Keep cleaning. Royce Calloway said it without looking down, the way a man dismisses a sound rather than a person, his voice carrying just enough volume to drift across the nearest cluster of guests and settle into the marble silence of the room. A pregnant woman was crouched near the base of the main banquet table, pressing a folded cloth against the slow dark bloom of red wine that had spread across the pale Carrara floor, her movements careful and unhurried, as though she had learned long ago that drawing attention only made things worse. The guests standing nearby glanced over, some with mild discomfort, most with the particular indifference of people who have never had to clean up after themselves. Celeste Mercer, the woman at Royce's side in a gown the color of winter champagne, placed her fingertips on his forearm and smiled with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to filling silence with elegance. A few soft laughs moved through the surrounding group, not cruel exactly, but thoughtless in the way that wealth so often permits. The woman on the floor said nothing, tightening her grip on the cloth, keeping her chin angled down, letting the dark fall of her hair shield her face from the room. But when she reached for the bucket beside her and the sleeve of her gray uniform shifted, the old silver bracelet on her wrist slid into the chandelier's light with the quiet insistence of something that had survived a very long time, and Royce Calloway stopped mid-breath and forgot how to move. He knew that bracelet. He had placed it there himself. It belonged to Marin, his ex-wife, and she was carrying a child. Before you judge the one who walked away, consider the door they were pushed through, and who held it shut. The Calloway pre-wedding gala had been billed in the press as the social event of the Savannah season. A curated evening of champagne, string quartets, and careful ambition dressed as celebration, held in the grand ballroom of the Harrington House Hotel, a property that Royce Calloway himself owned and had spent 3 years restoring to a splendor that bordered on theatrical. The ceilings rose 40 feet above hand-laid mosaic floors, and the floral arrangements alone had cost more than most families in Savannah spent on groceries in a month, though no one present that evening would have admitted to knowing what groceries cost. It was not, technically, a wedding. The ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later in Charleston, with a guest list of 400 and a menu developed by a chef who had cooked for heads of state. But tonight was something more deliberate than a rehearsal. A gathering of investors, media contacts, and the extended architecture of the Calloway family's social empire assembled to witness the formal presentation of Royce and Celeste as a unit, a merger in human form. Royce moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who had learned to perform warmth without feeling it, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with the particular smile of someone who understands that most conversation at these events is simply commerce, wearing a dinner jacket. He looked exactly as the financial press had always shown him, composed, handsome in a way that suggested discipline rather than luck, the kind of man whose stillness reads as authority rather than absence. But those who had known him before the money fully calcified into power might have noticed the small tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes occasionally traveled past whoever was speaking to him, and found the middle distance for a moment longer than courtesy allowed. Celeste Mercer was everything Meredith Langston had spent 3 years quietly engineering into the seat beside her son. She came from old Savannah money layered over newer Atlanta connections, and she had the kind of beauty that photographs well and ages into authority, an asset Meredith had valued from the beginning. She was intelligent and composed in the way that made certain rooms feel managed rather than inhabited, and she had understood from the start that marrying Royce Calloway meant marrying an institution as much as a man, and she had prepared for that reality with the thoroughness of someone who does not leave strategic decisions to sentiment. She stood beside him now and smiled and said the right things, and touched his arm at the right intervals. And if anyone watching detected the slight mechanical quality beneath the warmth, they were too well-bred to mention it. Meredith herself circulated through the far end of the room in a black evening gown, carrying the authority of a woman who had long since decided she owned every room she entered, checking arrangements and correcting a centerpiece, and telling the head of catering in a voice of absolute calm that the champagne was being poured too early. Everything was to be perfect. She had decided this, and there could be no shadows from the past permitted to fall across this evening. The call had come in just after 4 in the afternoon, when the hotel's regular cleaning staff came up 3 people short due to illness. Fallon Briggs, who managed the hotel's day operations with the quiet tenacity of someone who had solved every possible crisis at least twice before, had reached her temp agency contact and requested 3 bodies immediately. Marin Tate had been on the list. She had taken the shift without reading the venue details. She had learned in recent months not to be too selective about work, and had arrived through the service entrance at 5:30 in her gray uniform, her hair pinned back, her name badge clipped to her collar, her mind on the prenatal appointment she needed to cover before the end of the month. She had walked through the service corridors and collected her supplies, and been assigned to the ballroom perimeter, before she saw the gold-lettered banner stretched above the entrance arch. Callaway Mercer Pre-Wedding Celebration. She had stood still for exactly 4 seconds. Then she had looked at Fallon Briggs, who was watching her with an expression of genuine apology, and Fallon had said quietly that she was sorry, that she hadn't known, that she completely understood if Marin needed to leave. But the hotel was short-staffed, and it was only perimeter maintenance, and she could keep Marin in the hallway sections if that helped. Marin thought about the appointment bill. She thought about the stack of paperwork on her kitchen table. She thought about how she had spent the last 18 months becoming someone who didn't flinch. She picked up the mop handle and said, "Tell me where you need me." The great skill of invisibility, Marin had learned, was not about being small. It was about moving at exactly the pace of the environment, matching the rhythm of the room so precisely that the room absorbed you rather than noticed you. She had not always known this. There had been a version of herself, years earlier, who moved through beautiful spaces with the open pleasure of someone discovering that the world was larger and more generous than she had been told. A version who believed in rooms and in the welcome a warm room could offer. She was more careful now. She kept to the perimeter, working her way methodically along the baseboards and beneath the draped edges of the serving tables, collecting fallen napkins and the small wreckage that guests leave in their wake without ever registering that they have left it. The ballroom was loud with conversation, and the particular laughter of people for whom nothing had ever gone very badly wrong, and the noise folded around her like a wall, which she was grateful for, because she did not want to be seen, and she did not want to be recognized, and she wanted nothing from this room except to finish the shift and leave. A few guests caught sight of her and looked away with the automatic discomfort of people who are not accustomed to being reminded that their evenings require labor to exist. A woman in a red dress murmured to her companion that it was a touch unfortunate to have cleaning staff visible during the cocktail hour, and her companion agreed with a small nod, suggesting he had been raised to believe this was simply true. Marin heard it and kept moving. She had grown accustomed to this particular variety of dismissal, the kind that doesn't even bother to be hostile, that simply erases you from the category of persons whose feelings are worth considering, and she had never made peace with it, which she had decided was probably the correct response. It was Meredith Langston who saw her first, because Meredith Langston always saw everything first, which was the quality she relied on most. The older woman had been crossing toward the bar cart near the east wall when her gaze snagged on something at floor level, a familiar posture, a familiar deliberate stillness in the hands, and she had stopped as though a wire had been pulled taut inside her. covering the recognition immediately in the way of a woman practiced at covering everything immediately. Her eyes tracked Marin across the room for 60 seconds, calculating, and then she located the nearest member of hotel staff and spoke to him in a tone of quiet command, and the staff member nodded and moved toward Marin without urgency, redirecting her to the far corridor that ran along the service side of the ballroom, the section the cameras didn't reach and the guests rarely drifted toward. Marin went without question. She could hear the conversation near the main stage from where she worked, the voices carrying the way large rooms sometimes amplify sound at their edges. And a group of men she didn't recognize were discussing Royce's last acquisition. And one of them said something about how the man had channeled everything into work since the divorce. How that kind of thing either destroys a person or sharpens them into something extraordinary. And another said that the first marriage had been a mistake from the start, the wrong kind of woman, frankly. Not the kind who understood what it meant to be part of something like the Calloway name. Marin heard all of it. She pressed her cloth against the baseboard and heard all of it, and breathed through her nose, and thought about the appointment she needed to make, and about the small stack of books she had been reading about labor and delivery, and about what it meant to bring a child into the world with steady hands. The glass went over just after 9 o'clock, during a lull in the string quartet's set, when the room had settled into the comfortable murmur of people who have eaten well and drunk enough to feel generous toward one another. It was a heavy-bodied red from the second pour, expensive enough that the spilling of it functioned as a kind of display, and it went over with the kind of dramatic certainty that suggests it was not entirely accidental. A careless elbow, or perhaps more than careless, the sort of nudge that certain kinds of people deliver as a test of other people's responses. The wine spread across the pale floor in a wide, dark arc directly in front of the main banquet table, precisely where most of the important guests were standing, precisely where the cameras would catch it if it wasn't addressed immediately, and a ripple of displeasure moved through the nearest cluster. Someone called for staff. Marin was the closest. She had gathered a clean cloth and the mop bucket and arrived at the spill before anyone had finished commenting on it, lowering herself carefully, conscious of the weight she carried now, of the way her center of balance had shifted over the past months, and beginning to work at the edge of the stain with the steady, unhurried movements of a person who has learned that efficiency is more important than speed. She was aware of the attention. She did not look up. Meredith Langston's voice cut across from somewhere nearby, not directed at Marin precisely but positioned, so that Marin and everyone in the immediate area would hear it clearly. Something about standards of service, about the importance of knowing one's role, about how certain disruptions could so easily be avoided if the appropriate people understood their appropriate place. The words had the practiced cadence of someone who delivers cruelty in the grammar of management, each phrase buffed smooth, so that nothing could be isolated and named, only felt. Celeste moved slightly closer to Royce, her expression registering the spill as a minor inconvenience, and the response to it as mildly distasteful, and one of the men from the group near the stage said something low to his companion. Marin didn't catch the words, but she caught the register of them, the tone that carries humor at someone else's expense without committing fully to the cruelty of it. A woman nearby made a sound of theatrical sympathy, a pregnant cleaning woman, at a gala, on the floor. Well, wasn't that just something? She left the sentence unfinished. She didn't need to finish it. Royce Calloway stepped forward from the edge of the group. He had not been fully watching the spill. He had been half-turned in conversation with a man from the investment side of a media partnership, and the spill had entered his peripheral awareness as an irritation. He did not look down at the woman on the floor. He looked over her, at the stain, at the cleanup, the way one looks at a process rather than a person. "Keep cleaning," he said. The words were not angry. They were not even particularly cold. They were simply the words of a man who had stopped noticing the people who maintained the surfaces of his world. The nearby guests received the comment easily, a few offering the soft, complicit laughter of people who are relieved that someone else defined the moment for them, and Celeste turned back toward Royce, as though the episode had already concluded. Marin did not look up. She kept her hand moving, kept the cloth working in long, even strokes, and she breathed through the particular stillness she had cultivated over the past 18 months. Not peace exactly, but its disciplined cousin, a practiced refusal to let other people's carelessness set the terms of her dignity. She reached for the bucket beside her and pulled it closer, and the movement shifted the sleeve of her uniform, and the silver bracelet on her wrist, old and simple, its surface worn smooth with years of wearing, slid free of the cuff and caught the light from the chandelier directly above, hanging there in the brightness for just a moment with the quiet insistence of something that has outlasted everything thrown at it. And Royce Calloway, who had been beginning to turn away, turned back instead. He had given it to her on their wedding day. Not a diamond, not anything the guests would have called impressive. His resources had been modest then, just beginning to accumulate rather than pour, but he had taken it to the same engraver his grandfather had used and paid for the inscription himself, standing at the counter, reading the words aloud from a piece of paper he'd carried in his jacket pocket for a week to make sure he had them right. For the life we build quietly. He had clasped it onto her wrist in the small hotel room where they had dressed for the ceremony, before anyone else arrived, in the particular privacy of people who are just beginning to understand that what they have is real. She had looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then she had looked up at him and said, "Quietly is good. I like quietly." That had been 9 years ago, and he had not seen the bracelet since the day she was gone. He looked at it now, with the whole of his body going wrong, something structural, as though the architecture beneath his composure had lost a support beam it hadn't known it was relying on. He looked at the worn silver, at the inscription he could not read from this distance, but did not need to, and then he looked at the wrist that wore it, and then, slowly, with the reluctance of a man walking towards something he knows is going to cost him, he looked at the woman herself. He crouched down slightly. He said her name, Marin. She went still. The cloth stopped moving. The conversations within earshot began to dial themselves down, the way conversations do when something real enters a room built for performance, and Marin lifted her head. Her face had changed in the years since he'd last seen it, or perhaps had not changed but had clarified, the way faces clarify when they have passed through difficulty and come out the other side as themselves, more precisely. She was pale. She was steady. She looked at him with eyes that held no performance of any kind, which was in that moment the most quietly devastating thing he had ever seen. He could not speak. He could not organize the landscape of what he was looking at, the uniform, the bucket, the bracelet, the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy, into any coherent form of understanding. He was aware of Celeste moving closer to him and of his mother appearing somewhere behind him, and of the sudden change in Meredith's posture that he could feel without turning, the particular stillness she wore over emergencies, the way other people wore expressions. Meredith crossed the distance in 12 steps and arrived at his left shoulder, her voice low and positioned precisely for his ears, and she said that the woman was clearly here to make a scene, with the confidence of someone who has pre-built her narrative, and is now simply delivering it now that the occasion has arrived. Marin had set the cloth down and placed both hands on the floor and was preparing to stand with the careful management of a woman in her 3rd trimester, who has learned that nobody is going to help her if she doesn't help herself. Royce reached out automatically. She looked at his hand. She stood without it. "I didn't know this was yours," she said, her voice quiet but holding no apology within it. "I took a temp shift. I'll go." She said the last word not with defeat, but with the particular formality of someone establishing that their exit is a choice they are making, not a condition being imposed upon them. She turned to collect her supplies, and Royce said, "Wait," before anything in him had assembled enough to decide it, and she stopped but did not turn, and he said, "Why did you disappear?" There was a long pause. The string quartet had gone completely silent. "That's a question I spent a long time waiting for someone to ask," Marin said. She did not elaborate, but she did not walk away. The story of Royce Calloway and Marin Tate had begun in the architecture of an ordinary afternoon. Not in a ballroom, not in any room that anyone would have bothered to photograph, but in a hardware store in Savannah's Midtown neighborhood, where a younger Royce had been trying to figure out a pipe repair he couldn't afford to pay someone else to do, and Marin, who worked at the city planning office nearby, had looked at the plumbing diagram he was holding upside down and corrected him without ceremony. He had been 29 and she had been 22, and neither of them had possessed a single thing that the world currently attributed to the name Calloway. They fell in love with the quiet immediacy of people who recognized something in another person they had not known they were looking for, and they built a life in the years that followed from exactly that foundation. Small, attentive, and genuinely kind to each other in the particular way that comes from having earned trust rather than assumed it. The money had come later. The first deal multiplied into 3, and then into a portfolio, and then into a company that occupied an entire floor of a glass tower on River Street. And with the money had come Meredith Langston's full investment in the shape of her son's future. She had not actively disliked Marin in the beginning, but she had looked at her son's wife with the calculating eye of a woman who understood that the currency of certain rooms is bloodline and connection, and the dense invisible network of who knows whom. And she had begun, very quietly, to find Marin's presence inconvenient. The campaign was not dramatic. It was subtle in the way the most effective campaigns always are. A comment here, a comparison there, a social invitation extended to Royce and somehow not to Marin, a dinner at which certain guests were introduced to each other across Marin as though she were a piece of furniture placed slightly wrong. Celeste Mercer had been in the family's orbit by then, attending the same functions, moving in the same networks, positioned with the kind of patient availability that Meredith recognized and appreciated. When Royce traveled to London for 6 weeks to finalize a development partnership, Meredith had moved with efficiency. She had approached Marin with a document and a story. The story being that Royce had authorized a financial settlement, a clean separation, out of a desire to move forward with his professional life without complication. And the document was a divorce filing alongside an accompanying agreement. Marin had asked when Royce had requested this, and Meredith told her that he had communicated his intentions through Sterling Quinn's office, that it had been discussed, that Marin must certainly have sensed it was coming. Marin had tried to reach Royce on 3 occasions over the following 2 days, but the calls had not connected, and a text had gone unanswered, and she was 26 years old, with no money of her own and no lawyer and no one in the Calloway world who was prepared to help her, being told by a woman of considerable power that the man she loved had decided, through the clean medium of legal paperwork, that she was done. She had signed. She had not taken the financial settlement. She had packed one bag and called a friend and left. Royce had returned from London to find his marriage legally ended, and his wife relocated, and his mother explaining with practiced grief that Marin had simply decided the life was not what she wanted, that she had been paid generously and had chosen to go. He had believed it, because it was offered by someone he trusted in a form he had not thought to interrogate, and because grief, when it is offered an explanation, tends to reach for the explanation rather than bear the weight of uncertainty. He had buried the marriage under the 16-hour days that began to define his existence, telling himself that Marin had been practical, that the life he offered had not been enough, that a woman who could accept money in exchange for a marriage had not been the woman he thought she was. Building the entire architecture of his grief on a foundation that someone else had laid, without once thinking to check whether the foundation was real. She had found out about the pregnancy 3 weeks after leaving. She had been staying with a college friend in Atlanta, working at a cafe, applying for planning department positions where no one would recognize her name, and she had taken a test on a Tuesday morning and had sat with the result for 11 minutes doing nothing but breathing. Not frightened exactly, or frightened in a way that was wrapped around something more complex and harder to name, a fierce tenderness that had arrived along with the confirmation and had not left since. She had thought for exactly 3 days about whether to tell Royce. Then she had written him a letter. A real letter, longhand, 4 pages, sent to the Calloway Group offices at the publicly listed River Street address. She had told him everything. The pregnancy, her understanding that the signing had been coerced, her hope that he might want to talk, her absolute clarity that she was not asking for anything except the truth of whether he had known what was happening and chosen it anyway. The letter had not been returned. There was no response. She had waited 6 weeks and written a second letter, shorter, asking only whether the first had been received. Nothing. She had considered calling Sterling Quinn's office and had dialed the number twice and hung up twice, unable to determine whether Sterling would be an ally or another instrument of the family's management. She had eventually decided, with the exhausted pragmatism of a person who has run out of energy for doors that don't open, that the silence was its own answer, that Royce knew and had chosen not to reply, and she had moved forward on that basis, because forward was the only direction that mattered anymore. Royce listened to all of this without interrupting, standing with his back against the wall of the wide corridor outside the ballroom, listening with the concentration of a man who is dismantling something he built incorrectly and needs to understand every piece before he can make sense of the whole. When she finished, he said, very carefully, that he had never received a letter, not one. And he said it not defensively, but as a statement of fact requiring verification, the kind you make when you are trying hard not to arrive at a conclusion before you have earned the right to it. Marin looked at him for a long moment and said she believed he believed that, which was not, she added quietly, the same as it being true. Fallon Briggs had been standing a few feet back, giving them room while remaining close enough to ensure Marin had support if she needed it, and she said carefully that she might know something, that about a year earlier, when a maintenance crew had been clearing old administrative storage from the hotel's 4th floor, which had briefly served as overflow office space for the Callaway Group, during a building renovation 3 years prior, they had found a box of misdirected mail, including several sealed envelopes that had been delivered to the building and never properly routed. She said she had put the box in archive because she hadn't known what else to do with it. Royce said to retrieve it immediately, then took out his phone and called Sterling Quinn and told him in 3 sentences what was happening, and that he needed him at the hotel within the hour. Sterling said he had been expecting a call of roughly this nature for some time, and that he would bring the other file as well. There's something you should have been shown 4 years ago, Sterling said. I'm sorry it took this long. Sterling Quinn arrived 40 minutes later carrying a leather briefcase that looked as though it had been opened many times and never quite fully closed, the kind that accumulates urgency over years. He found them in one of the hotel's smaller conference rooms, Royce, Marin, and Fallon, with the recovered box of misdirected mail open on the table between them. And 2 letters in Marin's handwriting were already laid out, their envelopes intact, their postmarks legible and damning. Sterling set his briefcase down and removed a manila folder and placed it beside the letters without theatrical ceremony, the way a doctor places a chart rather than a verdict, and said that what he had brought was a copy of the original divorce filing's financial annex, the settlement agreement, and a comparison document he had commissioned 18 months earlier, after a question raised during an unrelated estate review had made him uneasy about certain numbers from that period. The signature on the settlement agreement did not match the signature on any other document Marin had ever executed through the Callaway Group's legal channels. It was close, carefully done, but a forensic handwriting review was unambiguous. The signature was not Marin's. The financial records showed that the settlement amount, a sum in the mid-6 figures, had been transferred to an account registered to a holding company called Whitmore Advisory Group, a name that appeared nowhere in any public record, but that traced back to a private financial management firm, whose primary client was Meredith Langston. The money had never gone to Marin. It had gone somewhere else entirely, under a forged signature, to an account her mother-in-law controlled. Royce read the documents in absolute silence. He read the letters from Marin, the longer one first, all 4 pages. The handwriting slightly uneven in places the way it becomes uneven when someone is trying very hard to say something that matters. And then the shorter follow-up, and then the forensic report, and then the account trail. He did not speak for a long time. Marin sat with her hands flat on the table and her posture straight, not watching him read, not performing anything, simply present, because presence at this point was the most dignified thing she had available. Celeste Mercer appeared in the doorway, precisely as Royce lifted his eyes from the last page, her expression performing composed concern with the efficiency of someone who has spent years managing damage rather than preventing it. She said that emotions were understandably high, that documents had come to light warranting review, but that the evening's guests were becoming concerned, and perhaps this could all be addressed through proper channels in the days ahead. She said the word channels, the way people use it when they mean delay. Sterling looked at her with the expression of a man who has survived 6 decades of exactly this kind of management, and is no longer impressed by it, and said that some of what he had brought had implications that went beyond a difficult evening. He said it mildly. Celeste heard the mildness and understood precisely what it meant. Royce turned to look at his mother, who had appeared behind Celeste, with the controlled posture of someone who has decided the best defense available is presence, and Meredith said she had done what she believed was necessary to protect her family's future. That Marin had not been prepared for the life Royce was building, that sometimes a parent had to see what a child could not, that everything she had done had been done out of love. Royce listened to all of it. When she finished, he said very quietly, "That love does not require forgery." He said it once. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Royce returned to the ballroom at 11:47 and announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room that the evening was concluded, thanking the guests and directing hotel staff to ensure transportation for anyone who needed it, measured, final, the kind of delivery that leaves no opening for negotiation. The guests processed this with the quick social calculation of people, determining whether they were witnessing a private crisis or a public one. Some moving toward the exit with deliberate calm, others gathering into small groups to speak in the low, significant tones of people who have just been handed something worth discussing for weeks. Celeste moved to his side and said his name once, and then again when the first time produced nothing. She said that whatever was in those documents, there were ways to address it privately, that the engagement did not need to be defined by a single evening's disclosure, that they had built something real together that was larger than any piece of paper from 4 years ago. She said this carefully, and perhaps a smaller part of what she said came from something genuine. She was not, under the ambition and the maneuvering, entirely without feeling. But Royce was already removing the ring. He did it without anger, without in fact any particular expression at all, and placed it in her hand with the gentle precision of someone returning a borrowed object. He said that he was not ending the engagement because of what the documents revealed. Or not only because of that, but because you cannot build a marriage on a foundation you accepted without asking enough questions. And he had not asked enough questions. He said he was sorry for the evening. He said it clearly. Celeste held the ring and said nothing. Meredith was escorted from the room by her personal assistant before she could stage any second act. On her way out, she passed Fallon Briggs at the corridor junction and looked at her with the expression of someone filing a name for future consideration. And Fallon looked back with the expression of someone who has stopped being frightened by the way power looks when it's embarrassed. Royce watched his mother leave and did not call after her. When the last guests had moved toward the lobby, Royce stood in the center of the emptied ballroom and looked at the abandoned glasses, and the lavish flowers beginning to droop, and the untouched canapes on silver trays. The whole expensive architecture of an evening designed to announce a future that would not exist. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific weight of a moment in which everything false has been removed, and only the true uncomfortable shape of things remains. He stood with it for a while. Then he went to find Marin. Fallon had taken her to one of the hotel's quieter suites on the 3rd floor, a room with a window that looked out over the Savannah rooftops and the distant smudge of the river, leaving a glass of water and a bowl of fruit on the side table, and very deliberately not asking any questions. Marin sat in the wide chair near the window with her shoes off, and the lights turned low, not crying. She had moved past the register of grief that produces tears some time ago, into a deeper register with no visible symptom Simply tired, in the way that the body does not fully communicate and sleep does not entirely fix. She was tired of being careful, tired of carrying quiet dignity as a survival strategy, tired of being the person who refuses to perform bitterness, even when bitterness would be the most understandable response available. She was also, in a quieter corner of herself, something close to relieved, not because anything had been repaired, but because the truth had finally been placed on a table in front of someone with the power and the responsibility to look at it. Royce knocked twice and waited. She told him to come in. He entered and stood near the door for a moment, then moved to sit in the chair across from hers and folded his hands on his knees and said, simply, "I'm sorry." He did not qualify it. He did not preface it with explanations or the architecture that people usually build around an apology to reduce its exposure. He said it plainly, and then said it again, and then said that he had believed something about her that was not true because it was easier to believe than to ask the question that would have required him to look at his own family with clear eyes. And that was a failure of character and not just a failure of information. And he knew the difference. Marin listened to all of it, and when he finished, she was quiet for a while looking at the window, and then she said that the hardest thing was not the poverty of those early months, or the loneliness, or even the physical difficulty of being pregnant, without the kind of support that most people don't know they're lucky to have. She said the hardest thing was the specific pain of being someone whose love was treated as a financial transaction. The implication that she could be made to go away with a check. The suggestion that her presence in his life had only ever been worth whatever the right number was. And that was a wound that lived in a different location than ordinary grief, and it had taken her a long time to determine that the wound was not information about her worth. It was information about someone else's limits. Royce said he would take care of her and the child, and he said it with the certainty of a man who has decided, and the generosity was genuine. Marin looked at him and said that was kind, and she knew he meant it, and she also needed him to understand that she was not a problem to be taken care of, and that framing it that way, even with the best intentions, was part of the same structure they were trying to dismantle. She said that what she needed was not rescue. What she needed was acknowledgement of the truth, return of anything legally hers, and the space to make her own decisions about what came next, including decisions about him. She said it without hardness, the way a woman says something she has had a long time to figure out and no longer needs permission to mean. Royce was quiet for long enough that the quiet became its own form of response. Not emptiness, but the sound of someone genuinely hearing something for the first time, and choosing not to fill the space until the weight of it had settled. The legal review began the following week and moved with the speed of a man who had something to prove and the resources to prove it. Royce retained an independent forensic firm, separate from any connection to Sterling Quinn's office. Not because he mistrusted Sterling, whose conduct in bringing the evidence forward had been ultimately honorable, but because he wanted the findings to be unimpeachable, untouchable by any future claim that the investigation had been managed toward a preferred conclusion. The forged signature was confirmed. The account trail was confirmed. The chain of mail diversion was reconstructed with enough specificity to identify the precise point at which Marin's letters had been removed from standard routing and placed in storage where they would sit unread for years. The full picture was precisely what Sterling had described, and worse than what Royce had allowed himself to expect. Meredith was removed from the two family foundation boards, where she had held voting positions for nearly 2 decades, and her consulting role in the Callaway Group's philanthropic arm was terminated. Royce did not press criminal charges. His mother was 60 years old, and the punishment she was living with was already the loss of the thing she had worked so hard to protect, which was her influence over her son's life. Meredith relocated to a property in Charleston and did not contact Royce, and Royce did not contact her, and some distances once created honestly do not close quickly. Celeste Mercer issued a brief public statement through her family's communications firm, saying that she and Royce had reached a mutual decision to end their engagement, composed and final, giving nothing away. Her knowledge of the letters, She had been made aware, through Meredith's confidence, that correspondence from Marin existed, and had been handled. Placed her in the category of someone who had chosen ambition over integrity in a specific moment. She had not forged anything. She had simply looked the other way, and she would carry that. Sterling worked with Marin directly to establish her legal entitlements and ensure they were honored in full. A portion of assets improperly assigned during the divorce settlement was corrected and restored to her name. Marin accepted what was unambiguously hers and nothing more, which made the accounting both simpler and more dignified than it might otherwise have been. Fallon Briggs received a formal letter from Royce expressing his gratitude for her treatment of Marin. A letter she kept, because it reminded her that doing the ordinary decent thing is sometimes an act of courage. Marin left the hotel for the last time on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, walking out through the front entrance rather than the service corridor. In her own clothes, pausing on the front steps to feel the October air, the particular quality of Savannah autumn, which smells of both the river and something older, something that has survived a great deal. And then she walked down into the city with the specific, unhurried certainty of a woman who has stopped moving through the world apologetically. 6 months after the gala, an organization called the Grounded Table opened its doors in a converted row house on West Jones Street in Savannah's historic district, offering legal literacy workshops, document review assistance, and advocacy support for working women who had been coerced into signing agreements they did not fully understand and had not been given adequate time or counsel to evaluate. The name had been Marin's idea. Grounded, she explained at the opening, because the women it served had been told their footing was insufficient, and the table because every serious conversation deserved one. The funding came from several sources, none solicited through the Callaway name. Though one significant contribution had arrived through a private foundation with no public connection to Royce's business interests, and Marin had not inquired too deeply into its origin when Sterling confirmed it came without conditions. Royce had asked once whether he could be involved, and she had told him that his involvement was welcome, in the form of funding that carried no expectation of credit, and in the form of the quiet, personal changes she had been watching him make. He had reduced his public exposure significantly, stepped back from social commitments that had been more about Meredith's ambitions than his own, and reached out to 2 people his family had treated badly, and offered direct acknowledgement, without using the word regret to mean nothing. He had done these things without mentioning them to Marin, which was perhaps the most persuasive evidence of all that he understood something essential had changed. They met for coffee every few weeks, which had evolved gradually from practical conversations about the child into something that might have been called, with care, a friendship between people with a complicated, unresolved history who were trying to approach it without letting the complexity become an excuse for avoidance. Marin had delivered a healthy daughter in January, at a hospital where Fallon sat in the waiting room and where Royce arrived 40 minutes after being called and stood at the nursery window for a long time in a silence that had nothing composed about it. He had not asked to be present at the delivery, because that had been Marin's decision to make, and the understanding of this had mattered more to her than the desire itself. She named the baby Clara, for the particular quality of clarity she wanted her daughter to grow up expecting from the world. There were evenings when Royce arrived at Marin's apartment on Huntingdon Street to sit with Clara for an hour while Marin attended to the organization's work, evenings that carried a quality of ordinary life that neither of them commented on, as though naming it might disturb whatever careful thing was establishing itself between them. He had asked her once whether she thought they could begin again, and she had told him she didn't think in those terms. Beginning again implied going back, and she didn't want to go back, and neither did he. What she could offer was the present and the possibility of the future, and that would have to be enough for now. He said that it was. A year after the evening that ended the gala, Royce Callaway stood at the back of a fundraising reception for the Grounded Table in the West Jones Street row house, and listened to Marin Tate speak from behind a modest podium to a room of about 80 people who had come, because they believed in what she had built. She spoke without notes, about the dignity of labor, about the particular courage required of women who are told in 100 quiet ways that their presence in certain rooms is conditional on their usefulness to whoever has already claimed them. She spoke about the experience of being invisible in a room that your hands had made beautiful, and about what it costs a person to carry that without letting it define them, and about the women she had met through the organization whose stories contained the same architecture of coercion and silence and slow recovery that she recognized from her own. She did not make herself the center of any of it. She was the voice that carried everything outward rather than inward. She said at one point, and Royce recognized the moment she had decided to say it, the slight shift in her posture that preceded candor, that there had been a night when she had been on her knees on a marble floor at a party she had not known would belong to someone she had loved, and that a man had stood above her and told her to keep cleaning, and that she had done exactly that. "What I know now that I didn't know then," she said, "is that keeping your dignity in a moment like that is not weakness. It is the whole point." The room was quiet, then it was not. Afterward, when the last guests had made their way toward the door, and the rows of chairs were being folded away, Royce found her near the back table, where the remaining brochures were stacked. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out the silver bracelet. He had had it cleaned, and the clasp repaired, but had not altered it in any other way, had not re-engraved it, had not tried to make it into something other than what it already was. She looked at it for a moment without speaking, and then she took it, and she held it in her palm and looked at the inscription she had not read in 9 years but had not forgotten, and she felt the weight of it. Not heavy, not light, but precise, the exact weight of something that has survived. He had once told the pregnant woman crouched on his floor to keep cleaning, thinking she was no one, thinking she was a surface to be managed rather than a person to be seen, because he had not looked down long enough to see what was right in front of him. He had been wrong about everything that mattered, and the cost of being wrong had been paid by both of them in years neither of them could recover, and the repayment could not be simple or fast, or entirely complete. But the bracelet that had once moved between them like a sentence half-finished was back in her hands now, and the life they might yet build, quietly, as it had once been promised, had not yet been foreclosed.